agree with that. The intrinsic probability of believing in someone who's merely a human being is much easier than believing in someone who is the divine Son of God and whose followers claim he rose from the dead. But notice that in assessing historical hypotheses, we must not consider merely the intrinsic probability of a hypothesis, but you also consider the conditional probability of that hypothesis on the evidence. And it's that which is crucial in my argument tonight. I'm arguing that when you consider the evidence, then conditional or relative to the evidence, the portrait of Jesus painted in the New Testament is of a much higher probability than the probability that the canonic portrait of Jesus is correct. Now, I agree with Shabir that if Jesus did die as a blasphemer and didn't rise from the dead, then we should reject him. That's absolutely correct. And that's what the New Testament says. Paul wrote that Jesus Christ, preached as the crucified Messiah, is a stumbling block to Jews and folly to pagans. But the reason that the early church believed in this, despite that intrinsic difficulty, is his resurrection from the dead. And that's why my case hinges tonight on the evidence of his resurrection. Now, you'll remember I argued three things. First, that Jesus thought of himself as the unique Son of God and the divine Son of Man. And I looked at three specific claims in attestation for this. I was shocked that Shabir never contested this point in his opening speech. He never denied that Jesus of Nazareth, in fact, made those claims. And that is crucial, because if he made those claims, then as a Muslim, you've got to believe them. Because the Quran says Jesus is a prophet, and therefore you must believe what he says. But what he said is that he is the Son of Man and the divine Son of God. And therefore, you must believe in him. So that's critical. Let me just emphasize from his saying in Mark 14:62 at his trial, where he claimed to be the Son of Man seated at the right hand of God. Robert Gundry, in his commentary on Mark, asks, what did Jesus say that was blasphemous? And this is what he responds. We may best think that the high priest and the rest of the Sanhedrin judged Jesus to have verbally robbed God of incommensurateness and unity by escalating himself to a superhuman level, by portraying himself to sit at God's right hand and come with the clouds of heaven. In other words, incredibly, what Gundry is saying, without any consciousness of Islam, is that Jesus committed the very sins that Islam says are unforgivable. He robbed God of incommensurateness and unity. He committed shirk, in effect, if the claims were not true. But if they were true, then he was who he said he was, and we should believe in him. Second, I argue that Jesus suffered death by crucifixion. And here Shabir agrees that Jesus was crucified. Now, I find this remarkable and testimony to Shabir's genuine openness to the truth. Because the Quran says, they did not slay him, neither did they crucify him. But Shabir is willing now to say, yes, they did crucify him. But he didn't quite die. He was taken down from the cross still alive, barely. And they thought he was dead. And then they put him in the tomb, and God assumed him into heaven before he could pass away. Well, this is a hypothesis of desperation, folks. This is to resuscitate the old apparent death theory of 18th century German theology. And the reason that no contemporary historian holds to that anymore is that Jesus, as a result of what he suffered, his scourging, his crucifixion, in no way was he still alive when he was taken down from the cross. These Romans were professional executioners. The Jews had asked that the crucified men have their legs broken so that they would die quickly and be taken away. They came to Jesus. They saw he was already dead, and therefore they didn't break his legs. But a soldier took his spear and thrust it in his side to see whether he was alive or not, and he was dead. And the idea that Jesus was still alive is a hypothesis of enormous improbability on the evidence, and I think a hypothesis of desperation. Thirdly, I argued then that there's good reason to think that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. And I looked at the evidence for his empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus after his death, and the very origin of the disciples' belief that he was risen. Now here, Shabir says in general, well, the gospel accounts are contradictory. Not at all. Remember, we're not arguing about biblical inerrancy tonight. We're treating these as ordinary historical documents. And there is a historical core that emerges from all four of these Gospels. Any discrepancies or differences are in the secondary circumstantial details, and these are to be found in any collection of independent historical accounts of an event. The Gospels all agree that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified in Jerusalem by Roman authority during the Passover feast, having been arrested and convicted on charges of blasphemy by the Jewish Sanhedrin, and then slandered before the Roman governor Pilate on charges of treason. He died within several hours and was buried Friday afternoon by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb which was sealed with a stone. Certain women followers of Jesus, including Mary Magdalene, observed his interment, visited the tomb early Sunday morning, only to find it empty. Thereafter, Jesus appeared alive from the dead to the disciples, including Peter, who then proclaimed the message of his resurrection. All four Gospels attest to these central facts, and those are enough to provide warrant for belief in his resurrection. Many, many more details could be added by including details attested by 3 out of the 4 Gospels, but this historical core is sufficient. First of all, I looked at 5 lines of evidence for the empty tomb, and again, Shabir doesn't deny the empty tomb because he thinks that God miraculously took the body of Jesus into heaven before Jesus could die in the empty tomb. So we agree with that. Second, we talked about the appearances of Jesus. And here I think our differences are just academic. He points out from Raymond Brown, a good scholar, that there was a single appearance to the 12 that was located in various ways in the Gospels, Jerusalem or Galilee. But notice the quotation he read from Brown supported my view that there were recipients of resurrection appearances who were not among the official witnesses. And this is not a later development. So that actually proves my point. There were a multiplicity of witnesses, but of course they didn't name the women in official witness lists because women in that society were not very credible. Shabir says, but if there were many, then why does it say in Luke to remain in Jerusalem? As I.H. Marshall, New Testament commentator on Luke, points out, Luke offers a telescoped narrative where it makes it look like it all happened on Easter, even the Ascension. But when you read the book of Acts, which is Luke's sequel to his gospel, you find that in fact these appearances occurred over a 40-day period of time. And there's no reason to think that the disciples hadn't gone back to Galilee in the interim, just as is multiply attested in the other gospels. In any case, though, as I say, these are quibbling. This is academic. The point remains that wherever they were located, there was a multiplicity of appearances of Jesus alive after his death. And you've got to explain those. Thirdly was the very origin of the disciples' belief. How did they come to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead, which contradicts all Jewish beliefs about the afterlife? You can't explain that, I think, in the absence of the resurrection. Kenneth Craig, the great Islamicist, has written, Muslim writers confront a deep historical problem, since they are obliged to explain the impact of Jesus in terms of his teachings only. The place where the resurrection stands is for Islam a blank. Yet its sequel cannot be ignored, even if, on the Muslim view, it has to be a sequel without a properly total source. N.T. Wright says the same thing. Without the resurrection, there is a gaping hole in the middle of first century history that nothing else can plug. I think that the best explanation of these facts is that the disciples were right, that Jesus had raised from the dead. But Shabir offers an alternative explanation. He says God assumed Jesus immediately into heaven. Let me quickly mention some objections to this view. Number one, merely visionary appearances cannot explain the origin of belief in Jesus' resurrection. As the German theologian Hans Kessler said, the idea of an isolated resurrection prior to the end of the world goes against all Jewish modes of thought. So why, if they had visions of Jesus, as Shabir imagines, would they proclaim his resurrection rather than his assumption into heaven? He hasn't been able to show his hypothesis can explain